Welcome everyone. Today's going to be a really exciting lecture, and it's the impact of carbohydrates, or at least their general daily intakes, for anaerobic performance. And remember, anaerobic performance means without oxygen. So basically what we're going to do today is determine carbohydrate needs and the main effects of various carbohydrate diets on performance in anaerobic sports. You ever watch a sprinter and just be in awe of their form, of their technique, of their incredible speed? What's driving that performance? Well, sprinting, first off, let's define it, is something that you do that has undistributed effort and is generally less than 60 seconds in duration. I would argue that if you're doing a 30-second sprint, you have to pace. Okay, but we're going to define this loosely as brief, less than 60-second activity with no distribution of effort. Now, what I want you to notice is this. On the graph here to the right, we're looking at phosphocreatine levels on the vertical axis, and we're looking at the distance this athlete sprinted, which is a 100-meter sprint. Then on the right side of the graph, you can see the actual speed or velocity. So notice that the speed and velocity peaks at about 40 meters. But what you notice is that phosphocreatine levels have plummeted at that point. So basically, you're just trying to not decelerate after that. So the point is that with sprinting, we know that the ATP-PC system is very important. So, but here's the thing. Phosphocreatine dominates for the first 0 to 10 seconds. So you can see here that if you're doing a 30-second sprint, that the ATP-PC system is dominating. However, if you move over to 20 seconds, you see glycolysis takes over. So essentially, if you're doing 30-second all-out bouts, you become reliant on glycogen. Because remember, glycogen is your high-intensity preferred fuel. Now, one of the questions is, what causes fatigue in sports? If you do a 100-meter sprint, that's likely not going to fatigue you due to a decrease in glycogen. It's going to be more of a depletion of ATP-PC. Now, a 400-meter sprint, if you start off with high amounts of glycogen, by the end of the 400-meter sprint, you're still going to have plenty of glycogen. So you're not fatiguing because you've run out of carbohydrates. You've likely fatigued because of high metabolic stress. And that's very, very important. So glycogen is not limiting to a single sprint. But a single sprint can deplete glycogen more than you could imagine. If you look here, look at a 6-second sprint. It depleted muscle glycogen by 13%. That means your carbohydrate stores are drained 13%. If you look at a 30-second sprint, your carbohydrate stores are depleted by 25%. That's just a 30-second sprint. If you recall from our aerobic lecture, that would take probably anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes to accomplish with long duration, moderate to low intensity cardio. So even though glycogen might not be limiting if you have normal levels with a single sprint, we do need to consider multiple sprints. So if we look here, if you take a person who does a single sprint for 6 seconds, that's about 13% decline. However, after 10 sprints, you're about a 36% decline. So we can see that this decline is not linear. Okay? After a hockey game, which you're sprinting all game long, you might deplete by 60%. The reason why it's likely not linear is because if you're doing multiple sprints back to back to back to back, you may start to rely on aerobic metabolism as well. So, or the other thing that could be happening is that you're not able to maintain the same velocity, so you're not depleting as much with each continued sprint, just due to the metabolic stress. Now, what you can see is that in a hockey game where you're doing repeated sprints, glycogen can become limiting. So it's more repeated sprints, not a single sprint, that can cause a limitation to performance. Now, what do I mean by all-out 30-second sprint? Because you have to be asking, whoa, how can you actually decrease muscle glycogen by like 25, 26% with 30-second sprint? It doesn't make sense. Well, in the laboratory, in our lab, this is how we do sprints.
1, go! Go! Go, Joe! Get it up! Push! Harder, Joe! Come on! Finish! Go! Go, go, go! Go! Come on, you got more
20
in you!
seconds!
Push harder! Push harder, Joe! Come on, you got more in you! Don't stop! Do not slow down! Get it up! Get it up, Joe!
10 seconds, come on!
Breathe! Come on! Finish stronger!
6,
You are not
5,
done!
4,
Finish!
3,
Go!
2,
Get it up!
1, gun!
So that is what an all-out sprint looks like. Undistributed effort.
1.
Now, let's talk about repeated sprinting. What happens, obviously with repeated sprinting, glycogen becomes very important. So this study here compared high carbohydrates to 7 grams of carbs per kilogram versus 0.4 grams of carbs per kilogram. So it was a very, very low carbohydrate diet. If you look at muscle glycogen levels pre-sprint, the muscle glycogen of the low carbohydrate condition was very low. Post-sprint, it was very low. Now, if you look here at this graph, the black, this is basically end pedaling frequency, so sprinting frequency. If you look at the black, what that is essentially is the frequency of the low carb group, and then the striped is the frequency of the high carb group. Now, statistically, there is no difference for the first half. However, the last half, or at least the last third, you see decrements in repeated sprint ability. So, very low carbohydrates could impair sprinting performance. This is a really good study by Langford. Basically, what they showed is that if you do a 30-second all-out sprint, if you look at peak power, which is P max, there's no difference between giving someone a 50% carbohydrate diet versus a 5% carbohydrate diet. However, if you look at mean performance over 30 seconds, that's where you see the difference. So, again, with very low carbohydrate diets, we're going to see changes with repeated sprints or sprints over 5 seconds. But what about moderate carbohydrate diets versus high carbohydrate diets? Is there a benefit from going from moderate to high? We know that moderate to high is better than nothing. But again, what about moderate versus high? So this study gave a 70% carbohydrate diet, or 525 grams of carbs, or 7 grams per kilogram, versus a 50% CHO diet with 300 grams of carbs, or 4 grams of carbs per kilogram. And they looked at sprint to exhaustion at 125% VO2 max, very high intensities. Notice that the pre-glycogen levels were much higher, and that's what we're seeing in this graph in the high carbohydrate versus the moderate carbohydrate. However, the rate that carbohydrates or glycogen was used was not different if you look at the pre to post sprint. Moreover, there was no difference in performance. So high carbohydrates did not seem to be any better than moderate. This was confirmed here in this study by Lamb, where they took sprinters and they had them do swimming sprints for 50 meters, 100 meters, 200 meters. And the white is the 80% carbohydrate diet, or 11 grams of carbs per kilogram body weight, like almost 900 grams of carbs versus 6 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight. So moderate versus very high. What you notice is that on all of the sprints, there are no difference between the 80% and the 43% moderate carbohydrate diet. So high doesn't seem to be necessarily beneficial for sprinting ability. But what about if you're prepping for, a lot of sports are weight sports, like wrestling, for example, weightlifting. People are trying to make weight. How important are carbohydrates in this situation? So what they did here is they took highly trained wrestlers and lost 6% body weight over 4 days' time, which is very common. So they compared a high versus moderate carbohydrate diet, 66 versus 42%, on 8 15-second intervals. So what you see is this. Days 1 and 2, they both had 2,500 calories, and one group was 5.8 grams per kilogram, the other was 3.8 grams per kilogram. Then they went down to under 2,000 calories. You had 312 versus 210 grams, or 4.4 versus 3. And day 4, they were super low calorie, 1,350, 222 versus 141 grams of carbs. That's 3 grams per kilogram versus 2 grams per kilogram. What I want you to look at is the sprint ability or the sprint work done. If you look at the high carbohydrate group from pre-weight loss to post-weight loss, no change. But the low carbohydrate group did decline. So essentially you do want to keep your carbohydrates on probably the upper end, or at least moderate, like 3 to 5 grams per kilogram when you're dieting. If it drops below that, such as this case where it's 2 grams per kilogram, when you're dieting or you're trying to make weight, that could cause issues. What about resistance training, which is obviously one of my most fascinating interests that I have is resistance training. People just trying to overcome external loads. How much glycogen do you deplete here? Well, in general, if you look at this table, this is some of the best studies that have looked at glycogen depletion. You see on average a 30% or 25 to 40% decline in muscle glycogen levels in a typical 3 to 20 set workout. So it depends on what you're working. So lower volume, you might be able to deplete 20% in your arms with three sets. However, it would take 20 sets to deplete legs of 20 to 30%. So that's important to understand. Again, one good way to look at it is imagine you have 100 units to start with. So now you deplete it by 30% on average with high volume training. If you're training low volume, you probably won't deplete as much for the larger body parts. So with resistance training, they took this study here and they had a low carbohydrate diet, which is 100 grams per day, 2 days after a glycogen depleting exercise, versus a normal carbohydrate diet. What I want you to see is if you look at the control group, that's the normal carbs, what they were looking at was strength endurance. So you see the first set, they got 18 reps, second, 13, last 10. However, the experimental group that had low carbs after glycogen depletion, meaning they were glycogen depleted, got 12 reps, 10, and 10. So their volume was significantly lower. So it indicates maybe too low carbs is also not good for resistance training. However, I might add that later in other lectures, we're going to come back and question this. So if you look at resistance training adaptations, here we see no differences in average peak or mean power between 4 sets of 12 jump squats at 30% 1RM. And basically, one thing I want to point out is you have a 50% carbohydrate diet versus an 80% carbohydrate diet, and no differences in average peak power. So again, moderate versus high in power in jump squats, a form of resistance training, is not different. if we take this same study and you look at the moderate group versus the high, the black is the moderate, and the high is the carb group, which is more of a light checkered gray. You know, at the beginning, the first sprint you see, or the first jump squats, excuse me, you see from 1 and 2. You see, yeah, it kind of looks like it favors the 80%, but that's not statistically different. But it completely switches roles the last 3 and 4. So it washes itself out, and there's no statistical differences between conditions throughout all 4 sets of jump squats. To confirm that super high carbohydrates not better than moderate, this was a great study where basically they had guys do 55% carbs versus 30% carbs and recreationally trained men and women. And after 7 days, there are no decrements in any variable on strength. So again, moderate versus high, you know, even here, this is like on the lower end of moderate. There were no differences. Then here we see 40% carbohydrates, or 4.2 grams per kilogram, versus 6.3 grams per kilogram. And you're looking at repetitions that you can perform at 80% of your 1 RM. No difference between moderate and high. Bench press strength, no differences between moderate and high. And there were no differences in reported training volume. So again, what this is really indicating is that you really, as a resistance trained athlete, probably don't need a ton of carbohydrates. And that's important to sort of realize here. So what you're seeing here in this graph is a dose-dependent response of replenishment of carbohydrates. So if you were to have 3 to 5 grams of carbohydrates, according to this graph, you're going to replenish anywhere from 20 to 30, maybe 40 millimolars of glycogen, or 20 to 40 units. To put that in perspective, if we look at the collective data on studies, if you did 20 sets of legs all out, you might deplete muscle glycogen by 40 units. Okay. However, if you had 5 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight, you would likely replenish in 2 days, because you're replenishing with 20 millimolars per day. So basically my point is that at 3 to 5 grams per kilogram, you're not going to need that much time to replenish. And unless you're training morning and night every single day, your typical powerlifting split, typical resistance training split, that's plenty of time to replenish muscle glycogen. Now, this is not the complete story, okay? If an athlete does choose to select out a lower level CHO or carbs, then timing of that carb may be important. So let's think about this for a second here. A lot of bodybuilders and a lot of power lifters are carb phobic. So they're terrified of carbohydrates. They're like, you know what? I'll never go over 1.5 grams. You know, there's no way. So in that case, timing becomes important. And this is a very controversial topic, but let's look at the data. IV, the king of timing, what you're looking at here is glycogen replenishment. And you had one group which had carbohydrates immediately after exercise, and one that delayed it for 2 hours. So you look when the gray group that had it immediately after exercise, both at 2 hours and 4 hours, had a much greater rate, like a doubling of glycogen resynthesis. Now, a lot of people will argue that this doesn't matter if you are not training more than twice in a day. You know, if you're training once a day, it doesn't matter. Or if you're not going to train from morning till night, it doesn't matter because you're going to replenish anyway after 8 hours. However, one thing I want to point out is that this is based on a study that is not relevant to powerlifters. It's not relevant to most strength athletes. So the study that they're basing that on basically what you're looking here is you see 2 versus 4 hours. You see glycogen replenishment is faster with early feeding than delayed. But by 8 hours and 24 hours, there's no difference. However, this study gave over 1,000 grams of carbohydrates per day. Or excuse me, over 8 hours. Well, no kidding, as this comic shows, no kidding that you're not going to have differences. However, if you're having 1.5 grams per kilogram, which is very low, you're not going to replenish in 24 hours. We know that from the graph I showed you earlier. Unless you time those carbohydrates immediately after exercise. And that's the point. The point is many athletes, like physique athletes, don't consume high carbs, so it may be extremely beneficial. So look at this study. This is really interesting by Pascoe. Basically what you're looking at is pre-exercise glycogen levels. Okay? So what you can see is that essentially pre and post glycogen depleting exercise, you see a drop in glycogen levels. One group was given 1.5 grams of carbs per kilogram immediately after, or water. So you see that's the carbohydrate condition, is the one that bounces back up, and the H2O condition, or the water condition, doesn't. Essentially what happened was in the carb condition, they had depleted extensively, like 30% of their glycogen stores. However, they were back up to 91% of baseline 6 hours after with that one immediate bolus. The carbohydrate group was 29% depleted, but they just had water, and by 6 hours they were still depleted by 25%. So timing of carbohydrates may be important. If we were to summarize this lecture up, we would say that low carbohydrate diets impair single and repeated sprint performance. But there's little evidence for the value of increasing dietary carbohydrate to higher than moderate levels depending on the event. Okay, and so I would say 3 to 7 grams per carbs. The lower end with single sprints, the higher end with repeated sprints. So for example, hockey players may benefit from 7 grams of carbs per kilogram. But if you take a powerlifter or a bodybuilder, they're not going to need more than 3 to 5 grams per kilogram. And basically on the low volume, low rep days, use the lower end of that, and on the high volume, hypertrophy days, use the higher end of that. And again, that's 3 to 5 or 1.4 to 2.3 grams per pound. If you have an elite sprinter, I would say same concept, 3 to 5 grams per kilogram. But intermittent sports, likely 5 to 7 grams per kilogram is what's needed. So it's about 400 to 500 grams of carbs for them. So if you take your average guy, basically, bodybuilder, powerlifter, sprinter, 240 to 400 grams of carbs. If you take a hockey player, they might need 400 to 560. And this is a person about 150 to 180 pounds. So think about it. If you're a hockey player and you only have 2 games in a week, use the lower end. However, if you have back-to-back games, use the higher end. So some of the future research that we need, so far nearly all research is done in low, moderate, and high carbohydrate intakes on acute exercise performance. We need more long-term data. Right now, we can only assume short-term change in performance are important for driving long-term adaptations. However, as you will see in my later lectures on fats, long-term may be different from short-term. Thank you very much. This concludes today's lecture.